Hello guys, it is me, Known Wells, creator of Yumi Empathy. Today is episode 6. Woohoo! We've made it to 6! I am so pleased. Today's episode is another installment of Tony Time. Tony Time, Tony Time, Tony Time. Sorry about that. So moving on. Yes, today we are talking with Tony, my friend Tony, about PTSD. As we did in episode 5 with my guest Bernadette. If you haven't listened to that episode, please do go back and listen. It is amazing. Bernadette is a courageous human with a huge heart, and I love her deeply. She's so brave, and I'm just proud of her. So listen to her story about complex PTSD and her traumatic childhood, and just some great tips on when you're feeling isolated in your mental health. So just go back and listen to episode 5. Today in episode 6, I talked to Tony about how he interacts with his patients when it comes to PTSD, how he talks to them. And we get into a bunch of other things, of course, as we usually do in the Tony Time installments, but I hope you enjoy it. The disclaimer for the show is that Yumi Empathy is for informational and or entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Also, I need to say that as it pertains to Anthony Remincke, who I am speaking to on this episode 6, Anthony Remincke, aka Tony Time, is a California licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed by the Board of Behavioral Sciences, license number LMFT 47805. Tony, aka Anthony Remincke, aka Tony Time, is a regular contributor to Yumi Empathy, as you guys know, but he is not functioning as marriage and family therapist in this environment. So that's the disclaimer. So we're not sued, because I'm just a silly boy who has a feely heart and wears his heart on his sleeve. And I'm not a professional. So that's what the show is. It's about getting our hearts out there, talking about the stuff that matters, and being vulnerable and being open and embracing empathy. So I guess that about does it. One thing I will say is please, I'm trying to get the ratings and reviews up higher in iTunes. So go, if you haven't rated and reviewed the show, Yumi Empathy in iTunes, go, please do that. It would help out the show. It gets just more eyes and hearts on Yumi Empathy. Thank you so much for doing that. And without further ado, enjoy this episode 6 of Yumi Empathy.
La la la, you, me, empathy, yeah, la la la.
Welcome to episode 6 of Yumi Empathy. Today's show, I am chatting again with my friend and psychotherapist, Tony, for Tony Time.
Tony Time.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm okay. Are you really doing okay?
I have a fluey voice.
You do.
My throat is hurty, and but that's okay. I'm working through this.
He is. He's pushing through, folks.
Yes. So today's show, we are going to talk about PTSD. In episode 5, I spoke with my friend Bernadette Pierce about PTSD, And in this episode, I am chatting with Tony about PTSD from his perspective, from a mental health professional's perspective. So we're going to explore that a bit. We're going to talk about, well, let's just start. Let's just
jump in.
Let's just get into it. So, do you have any questions for me?
Well,
I have flu brain.
yeah, he's got flu brain. So this isn't maybe the time to ask you about quantum physics or the principles of time.
No, not yet.
No, not yet.
Not
Okay.
yet. Ask me tomorrow.
Okay. I'll check back tomorrow.
Okay.
So, well, what did you think? I mean, I get the wonderful benefit of getting to listen to the episodes or the interviews or whatever we want to call them after the fact. So I get the wonderful benefit of sitting back and listening to the two of you have your chat. And so how was it for you?
Yeah, it was great. Bernadette is so eloquent and sweet, and I just could talk to her forever. One of the things, there was a couple of sort of standout points for me with the interview, and we started talking at the start of the show about how lately that I've been feeling sort of a burden on people, like my sadness is a burden or my depression is a burden. And she was very sweetly empathetic in sort of relating to that aspect of mental health. And I guess I just wanted to bring that to the forefront because I think that it's a common thing for people. I think having mental illness it feels overwhelming at times. And when you have loved ones in your life, friends, partners, etc., it's going to naturally feel like it's going to be a burden on them. But, after that conversation and chat with Jessica and other people, like, I just have to remind myself that, like, they love me deeply, and they wouldn't be with me if my depression or anxiety was this burden that I'm building up in my head,
Oh, absolutely. I love the episode, and I loved hearing the two of you talk about your own personal experiences, and yeah, I took a lot of that away from both of you in terms of listening to the two of you really kind of talk about your personal experiences. And that concern that I think comes with when we're in relationships with people, and how does, our relational dynamics, our mental illnesses, symptomology, how does that then transfer into our relationships, and what's the impact on them? And, and even as you're talking now, I'm hearing that idea of, and the way I always kind of conceptualize this is through those early attachment experiences and our early caregiver experiences, with the people who raised us, when we kind of formed these relational templates about ourselves around those experiences, so how well attuned were our caregivers? How well did they meet our needs? How well, were they emotionally attuned and present? And what were their capacities to be fully emotionally involved? And the takeaway from that, and the way the brain's actually structurally developed around that template, till we now then walk away with this belief about ourselves, which, again, I hear clinically in my office quite often, which is these, core distorted beliefs, or these core, just a core belief, if we think about cognitive behavioral psychology, of this idea of, I'm, for instance, I'm too much for people, or I'm a burden, my needs can never be met, or I'm too needy. People will never be able to tolerate me. I'll engulf. I'll be too much. And and then it's always interesting. I find the ways that almost becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy at times, right? How we act that out then around the other people. And I love the work in psychotherapy and helping people change those core beliefs. And what I say is developing new healthy core beliefs that are far more accurate in my perspective than these very distorted type of beliefs that we grew up with. So it was fascinating to listen to the two of you and hear, how you both had you've both recognized this obviously within you and your relationships. And, so it was very fascinating for me.
Yeah. And stigma plays a huge part of it. Like, now that I'm thinking about it, like, the portrayals, of mental health in media and our society is that it is a burden in some ways. Like there's all these depictions that are sort of running through my brain right now.
Yeah, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm just like thinking of like people who are like sad and like, you know, like, oh, I'm gonna like, I don't know. It's just like it's like this weird, perverted, like over dramatic portrayal of people who have mental illness, and that's like the sort of super stigmatized version.
Sure.
And I just think there's a lot of that, and I think that can get in your head too. That starts to play like a character and sort of fuels your thinking that you are that burden. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so if I'm hearing you, it's kind of that idea that there's this mirror coming back to you through media, that is portraying mental health in a particular light, and so the message that you're receiving back is, well, you are a burden, or this really is overwhelming, and you know, look at the negative impact that it's having on this person, you know, who we're portraying in this particular light. And I think there are. Granted, I think this is the point that you're making too. If it's media based, then we're going to generally go for some extreme form of this particular issue, right? We're going to have some extreme type of way that this particular symptomology is playing itself out, and and obviously that's not always the way that it plays out in real life, but shock value, I guess, right? Or kind of some extreme form to make sure that we're getting viewers or we're making a point, and it can be a lot more subtle. And, but I could certainly see where you would say there, or experienced that as having, a very negative type of impact, as we talk about stigma here quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think, even for myself, like when it comes to feeling like a burden, like I almost even get to a point where I'm like romanticizing it. I have this like, long streak of, wanting, being the sort of tortured writer and the tortured artist, right. And I need to do it alone, and and there's that sort of ethos as well that sort of plays a role in that. I think a little bit, and I think there's some value in that, but I think it can do damage in this regard for sure.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, in a scenario like that for people, if that's the romanticized version of it, I still wonder how much that prevents the real needs from being met, right? So although we can kind of dramatize it in this very romantic, maybe kind of way, particularly if there's if it's a person who maybe is more creative, and yet these real needs are being unmet, right? And so it's this kind of chronic cycle of maybe a downward type of spiral, not necessarily, but potentially, and real needs are going unmet, and I actually thinking about this and thinking about PTSD and thinking about, all the different peoples or all the different ways in which we've thought of post-traumatic stress disorder, and maybe even what we've learned about it from the media. And, and I would say most people's idea of PTSD comes from, returning soldiers, war veterans and so forth. People who have fought. I mean, that's kind of where we get the original idea of people who return from the war with, I think, what we used to call shell shock and, different, versions of that. And now really understanding that it's this, not just reserved, obviously, for people who have been in war situations, although that's definitely very common for people to come back with a post-traumatic stress type of experience. But, there's a lot of ways in which we can experience post-traumatic stress. And there's a lot of ways in which I think it impacts a lot of people who have certainly never been in, again, some war, type of setting, but, car accidents, traumatizing childhoods with abuse and a lot of different ways in which somebody can experience a threat to their life, a threat to their safety. And, what becomes so fascinating about this is what the brain basically ends up doing with that type of information and the way the brain reacts to that type of experience. And that's where we get this kind of chronic, prolonged symptomology, I think that, today we know as post-traumatic stress.
So, I'm glad you brought up the military our sort of understanding of PTSD in the context of war.
Sure.
Right. Because that is the common one. That's the one we think of. And, we talked about it a bit on the episode with Bernadette, and, there's this, here's my question. where is the sort of research and the understanding of PTSD going, and where is it moving beyond just sort of out of that context?
I think it probably has evolved into a greater understanding, since probably where a lot of researchers, clinicians have worked with people returning from probably more specifically the Vietnam War. And, people like Bessel van der Kolk, who the two of you had referenced, with his most recent book, The Body Keeps Score, which is absolutely amazing, who he did a lot of early work, in the 70s in the East Coast with these returning war veterans. And in addition to that work, as he crossed over and was working with other people, and he started working with people who may have, experienced a car accident, or he started working with people who had experienced, maybe a rape or some other form of violation, and recognizing the similarity of symptoms, where there was this crossover of, hypervigilance. There was a similar experience of dissociation, and a disconnection, in a sense, from the experience, where it's whatever it is that we are experiencing in the moment is so overwhelming that there's literally a shutdown, and you hear women talk about this, and certainly men as well, but where they feel like they've disconnected from their body under certain circumstances, and recognizing that it through a lot of this work that it just wasn't happening with war veterans, returning war veterans. It was happening with other people who were experiencing other forms of highly traumatizing type of events. And I think since that time, since starting with the war veteran population and working through, we've really started to understand that, trauma happens, in a lot of ways. And, trauma in and of itself is basically something that happens to us in which it's really just more than we can handle. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a lot of different, brain-based type of things that occur in that process, which is for our safety. The brain is the most amazing thing. The more I learn about it, the more I'm fascinated by it. And that, it's there to protect, and it's there to ensure our survival. And, and if one of the ways that we're going to get through a certain situation is to basically shut down from experiencing whatever, shut down today, live tomorrow, kind of ideas is what the brain is basically doing. And so, so as the work kind of evolves from what we learned in the 70s through the 80s, through the 90s. And again, you have people like Peter Levine, you have, Bessel van der Kolk and others who are doing amazing work around this particular area of trauma and post-traumatic stress. So, and then now as we're understanding a lot of neuroscience and again, the way the brain reacts to these traumas, I really, foresee this as a particular field of study, I think, which we're going to be getting a lot of really great information, right now and in the, years to come.
Is complex PTSD part of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's...
Can you maybe, because that was brought up in our conversation, and she used it to describe her experience.
Sure.
And Bernadette's experience, in her sort of early childhood, and living with a mother who had PTSD herself, and having this child, having an abusive father, alcoholic father, and having this experience where she couldn't feel like she could be herself at all, know?
Right.
It's not in the DSM yet.
Correct.
How would you describe complex PTSD?
Yeah, it's
complex.
It's a very interesting, process. One of which I think, there's the potential for a lot of people to experience, because I think what you're looking at in a situation where it's complex PTSD is, you're looking at somebody who has had experienced, maybe from early childhood, specific type of dynamics, relational experiences in which, as again, the two of you were referencing, maybe not the safest of experiences.
Yeah.
Maybe again, there's abuse, there's neglect, there's a lack of emotional attunement, empathic attunement, and so forth. And so there's already this, development of self-structures that are somewhat self-protective, mm-hmm. that are already occurring. And there's already a disconnection, in terms of a protective, defended self versus a authentic, real self that's not having the benefit of developing, because of the social environment that that the child's being raised upon. And then, again, potentially, a parent with a mental, illness or a substance abuse problem or financial stresses and so forth. And as we kind of develop these protective type of relational responses, both intrapsychically and interpersonally, and then if you throw a trauma on top of that.
What is intrapsychically?
Oh, intrapsychic, so basically what's happening within the self.
Okay, yeah.
Versus what's happening in the dyadic, nature of a relationship. What starts to happen is, again, if you throw a trauma now on top of that and, a car accident, or, a rape, a, sexual violation of another sort, maybe it's, you've gone off to war and you already have these, defense mechanisms in place that were there because of these maybe unsafe circumstances that you grew up in, then you have this very complex type of process happening. So it's not like you had this very healthy, secure attachment. You have this wonderful, we call it good enough parenting experience growing up. And so
you call it good enough?
Yeah, we call it good enough. Or psychoanalytic term, the good enough parent, the good enough mother.
Okay.
And, so it's this idea of, we're not going for perfection. We're just going for good enough. And, something happens. Generally, what we have found is that, the capacity for resilience could be fairly high, and the capacity for adjustment to what's happened can be fairly high. I mean, so there's the probability that somebody might get through something that could be traumatizing to another person. They may be okay. They may not necessarily come through that traumatized. That's why not everybody who returns from a horrible situation necessarily has post-traumatic stress disorder, but some will. And again, I think it really does talk about this process of complexity. But again, somebody may have had a wonderful, secure attachment, good enough parenting, get in a horrible car accident, and certainly, still have post-traumatic stress. But again, probably not complex post-traumatic stress, but certainly, could be a very frightening experience. So definitely possible. So
it differs from person to person, really.
It really could differ from person to person, absolutely. Yeah. And that's why, it becomes complex, is because all these other type of factors potentially play a part. In terms of at least my belief, we all have different temperaments. I think we're all wired differently. And I think some people have a nervous system that's a little bit more, high wired, some people are a little bit more low wired. And so I think that's going to impact, somebody different. So there's so many different factors, resources, financial resources, emotional resources, and, support, different forms of support. So there's a lot of different factors that play into how well somebody may or may not come through a trauma.
Yeah.
So it's it's very complex, and and I think working with people with post-traumatic stress, I think is a very kind of specialized field, and I think really does require a lot of education, experience, and guidance, because it's it can be a very complex, hence the term process.
So what is your experience with PTSD in terms of treating your patients?
Well, it's interesting. And a great question was, as I was listening to you and Bernadette, process in your episode, and listening to the ways in which, you both kind of expressed emotional regulation or emotional dysregulation. I tend to see a significant amount of that in my setting, in my clinical practice. I'm a certified sex addiction therapist, and, so I work with, men who have compulsive sexual behaviors. And what I find is, it's not uncommon for these people to have experienced trauma growing up. And the sexual behavior initially is about, emotional soothing. It's about emotional escapism. It's about, shutting down, or trying to manage the emotional dysregulation and emotional distress that they feel by, engaging in a particular behavior that will give them these, wonderful release of feel-good chemicals and so forth. And so what I tend to see in my office specifically is, people who may have not done any treatment, with the trauma that they've experienced, but now have some form of compulsive behavior that they're having to deal with. So basically they found their own bandage to this injury that they had. And, it worked for a while, but ultimately it ended up creating more problems than obviously, it had attended to. And initially it became a, again, just kind of a Band-Aid, but then became problematic on its own. It's still, if we're going to go with this analogy, became very infected, and it became very problematic underneath the Band-Aid.
Yeah.
And that's kind of now what we're dealing with. So, so I tend to deal with, people who are now engaged in, really emotionally dysregulated type of behavior. And again, just like post-traumatic stress or trauma, you tend to get nervous systems and people who are very emotionally dysregulated. And so they're living life with a lot of hypervigilance. They're living life with a lot of, their nervous system is very upregulated. And so they're looking for calming, they're looking for soothing. And it's easy to find those in substances. It's easy to find those in sex, compulsive sexual behaviors, trying to basically regulate this system. And, Bernadette mentioned DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is, one of the tools and interventions people are using now to help people learn to self-regulate and to really, learn to calm their nervous systems, mindfulness, and yoga. These are wonderful practices in helping people also learn to downregulate, basically learn to calm the brain, sit with emotional distress, as opposed to go into any really unhealthy behaviors that people may have had, alcohol use, substance abuse, sex, overspending. There's a lot of different ways people can attempt to heal thyself, so to speak. So,
so when you have these patients who have potentially a trauma, and they are sort of soothing it with sexual proclivities. I don't know the right word. How are you treating that? Like are you working with them on DBT type of, activities, or how are you?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into that. And, initially, if you're working with somebody who is coming in with, let's say, compulsive sexual behavior, one of the first things that you're working with that particular person is, to get sobriety and around their behaviors. And so the first job is to get them to stop doing the behaviors that they don't want to be doing. Mm-hmm. And, and again, some of these behaviors can become, extremely problematic, threatening to, there may be potentially legal problems. Maybe there's financial problems, maybe, potentially a divorce situation. There's, all kinds of, problematic behaviors that might bring somebody finally into therapy to deal with this. So the first thing is, we're really going to work on getting that person to stop the behaviors that they're doing. And, as a certified sex addiction therapist, through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, Patrick Carnes developed a 30-task model that we work from. And that is a process to get the client sober and, and get him into recovery.
Sober just means stopping the behavior.
Yeah, trying to extinguish the behavior, the unwanted behavior, the problematic behavior from the client's perspective. And, so, a lot of the initial work is really focused on that and really getting the client stable, know, and it's, trying to do any real depth of work, maybe trying to get underneath the traumas or trying to get, into the deeper attachment wounding or, but, trying to get to the deep work before you get a person sober is going to be really difficult. And, potentially if this has been their defense mechanism and their survival mechanism, to manage their emotions because of experienced trauma, you don't necessarily want to come in and start doing deep emotional work if this has been their defense against experiencing
the dark arts.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, and again, I think that's why working with this population is very, you need to really get some quality education, around being able to work with this population because it's a very, complex treatment process. So eventually, once again, you've gotten somebody sober and, there's a lot of, or hopefully good enough stability around that. Then, there's some more interpersonal type of work that you can do and work around the traumas, work around the interpersonal nature of the person's emotional regulatory system. And, so it tends to be very long-term work, to really get somebody, I think, to a place that they want to be. And yet, can be very transformational.
It's sort of heartbreaking to me. Well, it is heartbreaking to me. It's not sort of heartbreaking.
Just a little.
Just a little bit heartbreaking, just for some segment of the population. Sure. No, it's heartbreaking to me to think about the, to use my example or my experience, people creating heart guards. I
Sure.
created my heart guard, and that was sort of my mechanism to protect myself. And, it was what I could do at the time. And I didn't maybe have the best systems in place to create something better for myself or more healing or healthy. And to think about others just going through that same sort of scenario or different experiences, creating similar sort of like behaviors that will eventually wreak havoc on them as adults. Like that's...
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you...
Yeah, listening to the episode and hearing you use HeartGuard actually stood out for me and was really impactful. And I loved it, by the way. I loved the term. And I thought it was so descriptive of, I think, what we do as young children to survive.
Yeah.
And I have so much compassion around that, and I think maybe that's where my heart then really comes into my therapy with clients, is because I recognize the heart guard they needed to survive their childhood circumstances. And I understand the necessity of the heart guard, and I understand what it was they were needing to protect themselves from. And so, my empathy and my compassion just goes out, as I sit with these people, because again, understanding that, we're trying to survive in a setting in which we don't have a lot of skills yet developed. And whatever it is, adaptively that we're doing to survive, and it can be dissociative. I mean, we can learn to dissociate and go into fantasy, which is very common. We can learn to just not feel. We can learn to become very disconnected from ourselves and simply just shut down, which I feel like a lot of my therapy is actually having people become reconnected with themselves. And a lot of that is through, focusing even on body, focusing on body awareness.
Yeah, talk about that, because our buddy Bessel talks about that a lot.
Yeah.
Talk about the body awareness aspect of PTSD. And
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think this is so much where trauma work is going, is and has been for some time. I mean, there's again great practitioners out there who have been doing body-oriented somatic healing for some time. Peter Levine's written phenomenal books, but one of my favorite is Waking the Tiger. I believe that's the correct one. I hope I'm referencing that correctly.
I think it's Lion. Waking the Lion.
Waking the Lion.
I don't know.
No. I know Tiger's in there. I think it's talking about, and he, illustrates in the book from an animal's perspective, this idea of, flight, fight, or freeze, and the survival aspects, that's used in nature, by these animals, in which it is a, nervous system based response to this flight, flight, or freeze type of response. And it's a survival based tool. And it's fascinating for me to understand, and I think, again, as all the research continues to kind of help us and guide us in understanding the body and how the trauma of these experiences that we're referencing today can so be stored into our bodies, but we're so generally disconnected from our bodies, and I believe a lot of therapy in the past with somebody who had gone through a trauma, the belief was, well, we need to get them to talk about the trauma. We need to take them back to the trauma. And I think we're at a point now where there's a recognition that, that itself can be very traumatizing.
Right.
To actually bring somebody back into their trauma, and recognizing now that a lot of the work is focusing on, again, helping a person become emotionally regulated, but also focusing on body awareness and bringing people back in connection to their body and helping them understand that, hence the title of Bessel's book, right? The body keeps score. This idea that there is your body is a recording device and your brain is definitely a recording device. And so although you may not have necessarily an awareness of things that have happened, you do have this thing called implicit memory, in which the brain still records and you still have a file, so to speak, about this experiences, and your brain is still developed an adaptive strategy around that file, and you probably potentially might be living out the body's defense and the body's survival around that. And so, but again, we are seeing a lot of people, do more somatic, body-based type of training. There's equine therapy that people are doing with horses, which, seems to, from what I understand, be extremely healing. and again, also just, body-based, body sensory-based type of work. And so it's really exciting. I think we're on the forefront of some really kind of exciting work that, again, is going to be very, I think, mindful-based, yoga-based, body-based, and, really helping people, down-regulate their nervous systems, find a way to seek this emotional regulation, basically to be able to sit through distress without becoming so emotionally dysregulated, or an inability to manage the emotions so that we don't go to anything that's destructive, or unhealthy ultimately. So,
yeah. And I like that. And because it seems like it's more looking at the whole self,
Correct.
Right? Body and mind,
Correct.
and recognizing the fact that traumas, PTSD, affect the physical body as well as the mind. And,
Absolutely.
And so,
well, even as you were mentioning that, I was thinking about, sitting in my clinical practice, and, sometimes if, I see somebody who's just so upregulated, and a lot of times I'll start to feel that in my body,
Yeah.
I'm learning to pay attention to that, in the room. How am I experiencing this person? What am I sensing in my body? What am I feeling? And if I'm starting to recognize that I'm taking very, short, shallow breaths, and I'm feeling very uptight, to kind of maybe bring that experience into the room and be able to talk about it. And even, maybe being able to stop and say, I'm wondering if we can take a deep breath at this moment and just stop for a second, kind of center ourselves, ground ourselves. And, I have found that seems to have been extremely helpful with clients reporting that, once they're able to do that they kind of have this reconnection experience, or, they may find, an emotion that they weren't aware of that they were feeling, or they may now become aware of, I didn't know how, tense I was feeling in my shoulders or in my neck. And, we'll talk about that for a little bit, and, let's sit with that for a second, and, let's focus on that area. And, it's been fairly amazing. It's pretty remarkable.
That's awesome. I used to write breathe on my hand.
Yes.
Like for ages, I would write like in pen, like right on my left hand by my thumb, and just remind myself to breathe, for that exact same purpose. Because I recognized in my physical self that when I did take a moment to breathe, deep breath in, deep breath out, and really sort of not think about anything else, let everything go. It's very, it's meditative. It's very
so calming.
Therapeutic, calming. Yeah.
Yeah, it really, it's probably one of the simpler things, that any of us can do, is just stop, if we're feeling really stressed, if we're feeling really uptight, dysregulated, just stressed, and to be able to stop and just take 30 seconds to breathe. And, focused breathing, making sure that we're taking deep breaths, and, and just being very intentional and purposeful about, observing ourselves as we're, and being very intentional about the type of breathing that we're taking. I've found that to be, just so remarkably centering, grounding, and really help people, get, in touch emotionally with maybe what they weren't experiencing. I've even had clients stop and just be so surprised, that they were just, I didn't even know I was in that state at all. But now that I've stopped and I've breathed, I realize I was really uptight, or, I was feeling this. And so it's really, really the simplest thing that just seems to have remarkable results.
It sometimes takes, and, if you're the person who feels like, oh, I didn't realize I was in that state.
Right.
Like, that's okay.
Right.
Like, sometimes it takes another person to call you out, and that's okay. Because, we all get in our own heads and
absolutely
don't realize what path we're taking emotionally,
Yeah, and and that's always, again, what I find so fascinating about the therapeutic relationship, or an interpersonal, didactic type of relationship is that feedback that we get from another person, right? Who's observing us, who's experiencing us. And I think, again, that's one of the great benefits of psychotherapy, is the ability to sit with another person who is emotionally, empathically present and attuned, and to be able to share with that person, like, I'm feeling really anxious. I'm wondering if you're feeling the same thing. Or, I've been noticing that you've been taking really, shallow breaths, or you haven't stopped talking for the last 10 minutes. And, I feel like, maybe what if we just stopped for a second and took a breath? So, having, I think, somebody attuned to what we're going through, I think makes, a huge difference. So
totally. So you have to have Jessica's and
right.
other people.
Exactly.
you mentioned the Bessel book.
Yeah.
What other would you recommend any other resources to help people, learn more about PTSD?
Well, yeah, I mean, Bessel's book for sure. I mean, I can't recommend that one enough. And again, that's Bessel van de Kock, The Body Keeps Score. I mean, I think I'm rereading it for like the third or fourth time. I mean, and
I think that was the one Bernadette said she was reading.
And she was reading as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just absolutely an amazing book, so thick.
I'd like to read that.
Yeah, with just wonderful research and clinical experience and practical experience. So that, definitely that. Again, Peter Levine, I highly recommend, and again, believe it's Waking the Tiger but he has others as well, but I love that book. So those are definitely the two that I highly recommend that people read regarding this particular issue. Alexandra Katahakis has a book. It's called Affect Regulation and I think Sexual Compulsivity. Once again, Alexandra Katahakis. And again, that's for people who are, probably dealing with compulsive sexual behavior. But again, it looks at it from a perspective of emotional dysregulation. I mean, if somebody really wanted to geek out kind of on everything that we're talking about, Dr. Alan Shore has written a lot of great books on emotional regulation and dysregulation. And I had one other come into my mind, and Louis Cozzolino has written a lot of great books recently on neuroscience and psychotherapy. Daniel Siegel. I think that should keep everyone busy for 10 years, maybe.
Yeah, that's good. And I'll make sure to include all those links in the show notes. The last thing I wanted to mention, and you mentioned it briefly earlier, is one of the points that Bernadette and I were chatting about early on in our interview is just the mental health systems in place, and particularly in Australia where she's at in Perth. And we were just talking briefly about just the, how's it compare here? And I was, I'm obviously very ignorant. Where are we at with sort of PTSD research? And you had mentioned earlier that, you're excited to see where things are going and things are on a good path, but maybe explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. The first thought that came to my head was, I wish I knew.
Okay.
I mean,
You're fired.
I'm fired. I know. This was...
You're my expert.
I know. So much for the expert, right? So, I mean, one thing I'll say, when I heard Bernadette talk about, her experiences it was shocking and very dismaying, to hear about.
I feel for her.
Yeah.
Deeply.
Part of the mental health system that she's had to work with.
Yeah.
That was, disappointing to say the least. I think part of my lack of knowledge maybe in this area is because of my private practice clinical setting basis. So I work, in a very different type of setting than Bernadette does, irrespectively of the fact that she's an Australian. I'm here in the United States of America. But, so I tend to see a, part of the population who's generally higher functioning, who, has the capacity to benefit from, a single psychotherapy session per week.
Yeah.
And so I think the type
more
of population,
affluent area.
more fluent area and so forth. So where I think, she's seeing people who generally are, in maybe lower resourced type of areas. Maybe they have, financial restraints.
Sure.
Maybe there's high crisis, type of issues. And, what's any, government-based or systemic-based, what's their ability to manage everything that they're trying to manage. And I'm sure they're, having financial resource struggles, which I imagine we're probably having here as well. But I've never worked in those settings. So I think that's where I'm really lacking in my ability to really kind of speak to those settings particularly.
Sure.
But one of the things I'd be interested in knowing is I wonder what the VAs are doing here, in relationship to post-traumatic stress. How are they managing it? What are they learning? What are they doing with the data and the information that they're collecting? How are people like Bessel van de Kock and Peter Levine using that information? Or are they, again, pulling from their more, the type of institution work they do and clinical private work they do as well? So, it'd be interesting to know exactly what, in spite of their, 30, 40 years of experience in history, how else are they pulling their information today? So that probably didn't help you at all, but that's all I got.
No, that's fine. It, it humanizes yourself in the eyes of the listener. So.
Well, good.
Yeah, in the ears of the listener, I should say.
And when we say expert, we do the air quotes, right?
Yeah.
So
well, you are the resident expert
right,
here on You Me Empathy. You have the
lack of better term. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that does it. Unless you have anything more to say you want to say on PTSD.
No, I mean, again, maybe just the caveat or not caveat. That's not the proper use of that term, I don't think. Maybe just I'd like to promote that if anybody's, dealing again with this particular issue or any other similar or any other type of mental health, illness, that, they certainly reach out to get help.
Yeah.
And, don't suffer alone. And, there are mental health professionals and people out there trained to, help people in all forms of disorders and issues. And, again, based on, what you've created here with You Me Empathy is this idea that, obviously we want people to get better. We want people to live happy, joyful lives. And we want to make sure that people are getting, the most fulfillment that they possibly can out of their life. And, it's, my heart hurts, I think, like your heart hurts when I know that somebody's hurting and somebody's feeling isolated and maybe depressed and maybe overwhelmed, and maybe, distressed and hopeless maybe even. And so I just, I want everybody to feel that, we care, we're listening, and we just hope that they get the help they need. So.
Yeah. Isn't he a sweetie?
Aww.
He's such a sweetie.
Aww.
Yes, listeners, you are not a burden. You are not a burden here, and you are not a burden in the eyes of your loved ones. I promise you that. Okay, that about does it with this episode 6 of You Me Empathy. Thanks so much for listening. Bye. Say goodbye, Tony.
Bye, Tony.